Welcome to another episode of Things You Didn't Know About the Holocaust. My guest today is Yael Siman. She is a PhD of political science from the University of Chicago. She is currently a professor researcher at the Department of Social and Political Sciences at Iberoamericana, probably didn't pronounce it right, University in Mexico City. And what we're going to talk about today is the Jews who did or didn't get to Mexico in order to escape the Holocaust. So start wherever you want.
Yes, well, thank you for the invitation, Phyllis. I'm very glad to be here with you and your audience. Well, yes, in during the Holocaust, and it depends also what we consider the Holocaust, but between 1933 and 1945, many Jews, as you know, tried to escape Nazism and then the Holocaust, and tried to go anywhere where they could find a visa and authorization to enter that country. To Latin America, about 100,000 Jews came, and that's a very large number if we think even comparatively with the US or Palestine at the time. However, Mexico was not a country of open doors, in contrast to what many people believe, because it has been a country of open doors to other refugees or exiles. For example, the Spanish Republicans that were escaping the civil war in Spain and
Wait.
Franco.
We need to just explain this, which started in 1936. So the Spanish Civil War is before World War II, although the Nazis fought in that war along with, to test their weapons. But go ahead.
Exactly. So I'm just giving some examples of other exiles that came to Mexico, and therefore people tend to believe that Mexico has been historically a country of open doors. We can also think, for example, of the Chileans that escaped the military dictatorship in the 20th century under Pinochet, or Guatemalans who escaped the genocide in their country in the 1980s. So yes, Mexico was a country of open doors to many exiles, but not to the Jewish refugees. So that is important to keep in mind. And the numbers illustrate this very strikingly because, for example, between 25,000 and 35,000 Jews went to Argentina during this period, but only about 2,000 Jews came to Mexico. And if we compare that number to the Spanish Republicans that you previously explained the period when they came to Mexico, there were about 20,000 Spanish Republicans who were able to enter Mexico, but only about 2,000 Jews during about the same period. So that shows that Mexico was a country, I prefer to call it of semi-closed doors, because those 2,000 that were able to enter are very important, not only numerically, but qualitatively, because they were able to save their lives.
So what happened? Were there visas? There weren't visas? Give us a picture of people desperately trying to find any country that would take them.
Yes, so as people probably know, 1938 was a turning point because of the Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass, which was a pogrom against the Jews in Germany. Uh,
November 9th, 1938. Go ahead.
Correct. And then they tried to go anywhere, but yes, it became very difficult to get a visa. They not only needed an entry visa to the country of immigration, but also an exit visa and oftentimes a transit visa. So even if they were able to get all the kinds of visas that were required, maybe the dates of expiration didn't fully coincide. And oftentimes also they boarded the ship, but then one of the visas, especially the entry visa to the country, given that they had to wait so long, would expire. So in the case of Mexico, for example, because of the immigration law that was different from the asylum law, so Jews were considered immigrants. They were not considered refugees.
Oh, wait,
So
so you're saying the
mhm,
Spanish Republicans were considered refugees?
yes, they were considered refugees because they were escaping political persecution. And Jews were not considered as political refugees, except those that were left wing, opposed Nazism, and therefore were included in that category, but they were not the majority. So oftentimes Jews would board the ship and they would get to Mexico and they wouldn't have a valid visa, maybe not an authorization to enter the country. I've seen files of people who didn't have an authorization. And in those instances, you see the Jewish community of Mexico through the central agency trying to get them to enter the country, doing, a lot of political lobbying with the government, or their visas had expired, or there is a very fascinating case of a family that tried to go to Chile. At the time they couldn't disembark in Chile, this ship came all the way to Mexico, and because of very specific local conditions and also the lobbying of the Jewish community, they were able to disembark even though they didn't have an authorization to enter Mexico. But in general terms, the immigration law of President Cárdenas, Lázaro Cárdenas, who ruled at the time, was very selective and very restrictive towards Jews.
So was it anti-Semitism? Was he on the side of X or Y? I mean, or
So
is
I
it
think,
because it's
yes,
a Catholic country or why?
yes. So part of the reason is, yes, there was anti-Semitism and xenophobia at the time that was very strong in the country, as in many other countries. Also, an ultra-nationalistic sentiment that would lead to this idea that we need to protect the local workers, we need to protect the nation from foreigners, but also political figures or public officials in place that would rule against authorizing these visas. So you see, for example, now that I've been able to research documents in the immigration or the migration archive, the National Migration Archive,
In
you see
Mexico.
in Mexico, you see many like back and forth of correspondence between the relatives of the refugees and the government, and the relatives pleading the government to let them in, and then the Minister of Interior, in Spanish we call it La Secretaría de Gobernación, saying, no, we're unable to authorize it, even though the family member is saying they are in extreme danger, they can die, please help us, and still the response would be a negative one.
Okay, and you're talking about family members that were already in Mexico, is that right?
Yes. Yes. So this is fascinating because, in contrast to, or perhaps similar to many countries, but in Mexico is very predominant that the family networks were central in helping bring these refugees. However, it's not just the family members. When you look at the documents and also you listen to the testimonies, you understand that it was more complex because it was a web of actors playing a part. It was a family member, but that family member might have hired a lawyer, and the lawyer knew how to proceed. So you see, many of the letters are very similar, as if there was like a draft, to follow. Or the local Jewish community through the central agency. At the time, it was called Comité Central Israelita de México, which had also a commission that worked specifically on refugee matters. So that's also an actor that emerges. But there are also other sponsors. So it may be someone who's promising to hire
Mhm.
a refugee coming to Mexico, and political actors, because sometimes you see like someone who was contacted by maybe the family member, but we don't know if that was really a direct contact, or someone else who's not visible in the documents helped put them in contact, so that political actor would write to the Minister of Interior and ask, mobilizing, these humanitarian arguments, but also political ones, to let that person come in. So it's multiple actors playing a part in this history.
Okay, so wait, I can think of a couple of questions. Some people did get official Mexican entry permits early on, is that right? Before
Yes.
Mexico then
No,
shut
yes,
the
you,
doors.
you, you are right. And that's why I call it a semi-closed country and not a closed country completely. Yes. So what I found, and together with a colleague of mine, Daniela Glazer, we've been doing this research for several years now. Some started coming even in 1933, 1934, 1935, but there were really small numbers. And in general, not only Mexico, but Latin America was not really an attractive destination for people. So even James MacDonald, who came to Latin America to visit Latin America in 1935, and he was the commissioner, the UN, well, the League of Nations commissioner for refugees, he didn't like really find much interest, even though he came to the region. So it was really in 38 that as people tried to go anywhere, Latin America became an important destination. Now, many people really wanted to go to the United States, but they couldn't. So they considered Mexico as a transit country to the United States. And some of them were able to enter the country. So you see, for example, a long time ago, I interviewed a survivor who, of course, didn't consider himself a survivor because he came early, but he
I
still.
consider them a survivor. I consider
Yeah,
anyone who, if they'd stayed in their home country, were liable to be killed by the Nazis. That's a survivor.
I do as well. And he came even with his, how do you say it, everything, like even furniture, because he was able to leave early on. And I visited him at home and he had his furniture from Germany. I saw it. But other people, came without any of their belongings. Not only that, they had lost everything, so very poor, but they were still able to come in. And then you also have those that were politically left-leaning and they were able to come in as well relatively early. But some of them also went somewhere else, for example, to Cuba, and they waited there until they were able to come to Mexico. But we do see a peak of incoming of refugees around 1941. So the war is still going, it's already going on, and they were able to come in up to 1942, let's say. Then we see a drop, and then we see again people starting coming to Mexico in 1945, the ones that were able to come the earliest in the post-war period. And then we see another peak in 1946. However, also the files of the survivors show that Mexico continued to deny entry to many or prolong it. So, for example, I'm just saying this as an illustration, but Elena Boguslavsky, she was a child survivor who was rescued by a Catholic family. After the war, her aunt took her. They went to Łódź and then in
That's
Poland.
Lodge on our show. Just want to tell you, we're saying Lodge on our show. Go ahead.
Łódź, exactly. And then they went to Palestine, at the time Palestine, not Israel. And then only after 5 years of her uncle trying to bring her to Mexico, he was able to do so. So this child, a child survivor, was displaced multiple times until she was able to come to Mexico. And in the correspondence, I mean, it's very, very moving because you see how the uncle says, this survivor has, not only she's a child, she's an orphan. She survived the war, but she also has a moral qualities, good qualities, and who could question the good qualities of a child survivor of the Holocaust? Well, that's written in this document. So it tells you a lot about how negligent the at least the Ministry of Interior was towards these refugees, even in the post-war period.
I would say negligent is not as the word that I would use in English. I would say cold-hearted. I would say a child is not even going to take a job from anyone. I mean, but exactly what happens if, let's say they have a league, they had a legal, but then they get on the boat, and I know I've read a lot of like if you have this X and then it expires, okay. So you arrive in Mexico and it took so long to get there that your entry visa is expired. What happens then? Are they dumped on the shore? I mean, literally, what happens?
So, well, there is a case of a ship, the Kwanzaa, that was actually sent back to Europe. But there were so many instances where the Jewish community was able to, I say it under quotation marks, fix the matter. probably through the bribing of local officials at the port, including immigration officials. But that's really hard to know with hard evidence, because the documents also give you hints, because there may be some leaps in these documents. For example, they may say we are unable to disembark people. And then what you get next in the file is a letters or a telegram giving the instruction to let them disembark. So there is like a void or a vacuum there, but you can infer that maybe corruption, or probably most likely corruption, played a part, but also the huge efforts of the family members and the Jewish community of Mexico as well. So even though we do find patterns, we also have to look at every case, because there were also local dynamics. For example, the family that I mentioned that went to Chile and couldn't disembark, but then came to Manzanillo, to the port of Manzanillo in Colima, and they wouldn't let them disembark because they didn't have an authorization to come to Mexico. And then we see a local judge giving, I don't know how you say it in English, it's amparo, when you can protect someone legally. It's a legal figure in Mexico. You protect the person, sort of like giving the person immunity to be affected by a legal order, and they disembarked. But the local immigration officer apparently got really mad because the instruction was not to let them disembark. So you see in the also in these historical documents how he tries to get them re-embark the boat, but then we find an order from President Cárdenas telling them to allow them to disembark. Now this is extraordinary because you don't see President Cárdenas giving these orders that frequently in regards to Jewish refugees. However, in the file you find the League, it's called in Spanish La Liga Pro Cultura Alemana. So it was a league of German culture that was also operating in Mexico, and they had a close relationship with President Cárdenas because they shared this left-wing ideology, liberal, progressive, and they wrote to him directly, asking him to allow these people disembark. And there are other actors involved. So these families, there were a few of them that were able to disembark as a result of this very complex process.
Okay,
So,
so I have
mm,
two questions at once. I'm try and remember the second question. I'm making a note. So I just realized something. Whereas many of us know that Argentina during World War II and afterwards welcomed the Nazis, I think that what you're saying is that the government of Mexico was the opposite of Nazism.
well, yes, officially the government of Mexico was against Nazism. Yes, it was actually the only country that condemned the Anschluss, the annexation of Austria
March
by.
1938.
Exactly. So, yes, it had very an anti-fascist, anti-Nazi ideology. So, yes, however, there were some Nazi elements in Mexico as well, because there had been also a German community here. Of course, not every German was Nazi, but there were some that were, and the embassy, also the German embassy in Mexico, of course, because it was a
Yes.
representative of the Nazi regime. So they also did their activities, to promote their own ideology and actions. So yeah, but you're right. It's Mexico in that sense is very different to Argentina.
And what made me ask the question was you said something about the German cultural club. And so that cultural club was opposed to fascism. Is that correct?
Exactly. They
As
were left.
opposed to a culture, German cultural club in other countries that might have been supportive.
Exactly. And they also had relationships or bonds and collaborations with local actors that shared that ideology of opposing Nazism. For example, Vicente Lombardo Toledano was a very important political figure in Mexico at the time, and he stood openly against Nazism, fascism, and he also had some collaboration with Jews that also shared that political ideology. So that is very important, I think, to see how civil society also articulated and mobilized and resisted Nazism in Mexico.
Okay, so were there internment camps in Mexico for those people who were stuck on the boat and then what happened? Like the boat
That's
had
a,
to sail back. So if they didn't send them back, what did they do?
so that's a very important question because again, it's not a pattern because it's not like multiple detention camps were created, anything, not like that. But there was one agricultural settlement called Santa Rosa in León, near León, Guanajuato, and some Poles that were not Jewish and some Jews were sent to that place before they could find a way for them to integrate them, to bring them to Mexico City, for example, and actually they found some host Jewish families for them in the beginning until they were able to, settle with their own means because that was very difficult. So one of them, for example, is the family of Fini Constat, who's still alive. Actually, she lives in the US, and that's her family story. They came in a Japanese boat, and they came all the way also to the Pacific coast of Mexico, and they disembarked. Well, actually, they really wanted to disembark in California, I believe, but they weren't able to do so. And then they were brought to the border of US Mexico. I think they took a train from Nuevo Laredo all the way to Santa Rosa, and they were placed there. But she remembers that the conditions were very inhospitable, and there were the Poles that were there were actually very anti-Semitic. So she had a very hard experience in this sort of detention place. I don't know, I don't want to call it a camp, but it was a place where they had to be and couldn't leave until some arrangement was made for them.
That's why I've been working on explaining the different terms of camps. And that's why I use the word internment because I thought it was in English, maybe I'm not sure, but it was a better just keeping them somewhere until you knew, almost like a displaced persons camp in American sector in Germany after World War II. But I wanted to just go back because did they come on a boat from Japan because they got to Shanghai?
No,
Is
actually, they in particular, I think they left from Yokohama. Yokohama was an important port, and it was also, I think, for some refugees, it was a place where they could get their Mexican visa through the Mexican consulate. So they left from Yokohama, but they had a fascinating trajectory, very unusual. So it's not like the more common trajectory of refugees that came to Mexico that, for example, in during the period that I mentioned, 1941, many of them left from Marseille in France. Some of them left from Lisbon in Portugal, and some of them even from Casablanca in Morocco.
right.
And they were also helped by Jewish international organizations based in the US, like the Hayas or HISM. So, but in their case, no, they were in Austria, in Vienna, and Fini's mom had been born in Istanbul. So she had a Turkish nationality. So first they tried to escape from Vienna to France, but they were unable to do so. They failed. They were caught and actually allowed to go back. They were not detained. So they were allowed, there was a good guard, they're also good people. And they went back to Vienna, and then her mom,
Wait, do you
uh,
know what year this is? Can you just kind of
yes, it was like it was 1938, I believe, because the situation in Austria was already bad for them. They had to leave their apartment. They were displaced from their apartment, and so they were desperately looking for ways to leave Austria. and they were able to go to Istanbul. So they went to Istanbul, Fini and her parents, and for a few years they were there, but then they actually didn't want to stay there, and they were looking for ways out. And someone advised them to go to India. So they moved to Bombay. They were there a few years also, and then according to her, what she remembers, the Polish consul in Bombay became very close friends to her dad, and he knew that some Poles. This was an agreement between the Polish government in exile in London and the Mexican government through pressure from both I believe, the U.S. and England. So a group of Poles would be allowed to come to Mexico to this agricultural settlement of Santa Rosa, and they were about to board the ship, and then he told them, "You can go with them." So eventually, I mean, they boarded that ship they had to go, I believe, through Iraq, and then to get to, I do remember she says that they went to Baghdad, and eventually, well, they went to Japan. And then from there, they boarded the ship, and then they, as I said, they really wanted to go to the US, but they were unable to do so. And then they were sent to Mexico. They didn't have family in Mexico. So that's
Mm.
also extraordinary because, as I said before, most of the people who came to Mexico had some family connection, but they didn't. So for them, it was also hard to begin, a new life because they got this help from the Jewish community, but then basically they had to find their own way of settling and finding work, school, and especially reconnect with yourself and with life, the normality of life. So that was, I think, particularly challenging for this family, but she's still alive. She wrote her memoir in English, and she eventually moved to the United States, which was the main purpose of this trip, right, or journey to go to the US. Yes.
Is your memoir published? Is it?
Yeah, yes, I will share with you the exact title.
Yeah,
Let me
no,
put,
we'll put it at the
yes,
bottom of the description of this interview. You can,
perfect.
yeah, that would
Yes.
be
It
so.
is published and it is in English. Yes.
Okay, so what else? We have a few more minutes left. Is there anything else that, in terms of after the war? I noticed you said that then more Jews came. Did Mexico then open their doors a little bit more? What's that deal there?
So I think that's an understudied period still. So what I know based on lists that I've made of people who were able to enter Mexico is that there were a few hundred who came. I cannot even say 1,000, So, but I don't have a complete list either because not everyone was affiliated to the Jewish community. Some people chose to take a distance from their Jewish identity. And also because not everyone wrote a memoir or gave testimony. By the way, if people are interested, you can listen to many of these testimonies in the Visual History Archive of the University of Southern California Shoah Foundation. Many of them are in Spanish, but many of them are also in English. You can also find some of these testimonies in the Fortunoff archive at Yale University, because it's interesting, some of these refugees came to Mexico, settled here, but then they moved to the US and they gave testimony in the US, not in Mexico. And you can also read many memoirs in English of them that I found throughout the years. So those are the ones that I'm able to register or record, but many are not visible, even to a researcher. So maybe a few more hundred, but I don't think that many, because what we know based on the correspondence that I told you you can find in the National Archive of Migration in Mexico is that there was a still of denial and rejection or prolonged authorizations for people between 1945 and 1950. We think that this might have changed in the 1950s. and then it was easier for people to get in. But then another research question that I've been trying to address is what happened then, not only entry, arrival, and their first impressions of arrival, but also how did they find a way to navigate socially, culturally, politically, economically life in Mexico, which was so contrasting to their lives in Europe, and also for those who survived the Holocaust in Europe, whether they had any support institutionally, psycho-emotionally. We know it was a very different time. So I'm trying to uncover all of these elements of their post-war lives, not only through their testimonies and memoirs and historical records, but also through their families, their descendants. So
So,
this ongoing research, yes.
do you have any theories for why what changed in 1950?
Yes, I think, well, it can be as any historical explanation. I don't think it's monocausal, so it would probably be multicausal. And I think one of the reasons was probably the fact that there was not a refugee crisis anymore, as during the war and even before the war. Another reason, I mean, domestically, I need to analyze more. Honestly, I don't want to share an
Yeah,
hypothesis
okay.
now.
I understand.
Yes, but also domestic politics were different. The ultranationalism of the 30s and 40s was changing because also Mexico, if we remember, Mexico had a revolution in the first decade of the 20th century. So the 20s and the 30s were still very close to the revolution, and the institutional revolutionary party, the PRI, that governed Mexico for over 60 years, at the time was just beginning to centralize power, co-opt different sectors so that there would be some stability in the country. And that was still happening in the 30s, so then the 50s is already a very different period when there's already political stability in Mexico. So that may also play a part in the way the immigration policies were designed.
It's been fascinating. I must admit, I don't know very much about Mexico, but I knew that some Jews got to Mexico, and when I saw what your research was, I very much wanted to talk to you to just because again, we need to think much more about the 30s. That's one of my personal things. What happened between 33 and September 1st, 1939? And so I just have to share this one thing. Having been stationed with my husband in Munich, Germany from September 70 to May 72, and not having bought any furniture, even though the US Army would have sent it home. When you described the German furniture, all I could visualize was those huge trunks that they had. It's like an armoire, but it's like huge. And so I was laughing at how that heavy, heavy wood furniture must have felt in the humidity and heat of Mexico.
That's true, and also, I mean, of course, Mexico City, Veracruz is very humid and hot, and it's the port where most refugees arrive to. But Mexico City has a more pleasant, moderate
Oh,
weather. But I also think that it's wonderful to think, even in metaphorical ways, what does it represent for someone who's forced to leave home, an object, whether it's a very heavy piece of furniture or a set of, I don't know, photos and frames, because even the frame is a cultural object, right?
absolutely.
So, or your mom's or your grandmother's recipe book. I mean, for every person, it might be different, but certainly it evokes displacement, but also nostalgia, but also a sense of belonging, but also disruption. So, I think this is something that's very meaningful and relevant for these histories of displacement and refuge.
I absolutely agree. So I just had to share that little story because when you told, I just visualized the whole thing. Anyway, I want to thank you so much for sharing your information with us. And I wish you much success in learning more in your research. And I thank our listeners. But I do have to end on a down note by saying, I don't know if it's a down note, but you'll understand. May the memories of the victims and those who tried to save them be a blessing forever.